Dennis Toddy. It's just after 1 o'clock. We're going to give just another minute here to allow our last few people to join up, and then we'll be starting in about a minute. Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, this is Dennis Toddy. I'm the state climatologist in South Dakota and associate professor at South Dakota State University. I will be your presenter and host this week. Our climate services community is out doing a variety of things around the region today, from Wyoming to Illinois, so we're flying solo. Thank you, Jim Kinney, down in Kansas City, for helping line things up for us. This is the March version of our monthly installment of the Midwest and Great Plains Drought Outlook, Climate Drought Outlook webinar. Hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. Lots of a wide range of conditions, generally windy across the whole region with some colder air, and actually some snowfall in some of the Dakotas and northern Minnesota that is accumulating in various areas. So just a reminder, this is a collaborative effort among state climatologists, NOAA, the Weather Service, and other state climatologist regional climate centers, and the National Drought Mitigation Center, to provide it as a free monthly service for you to help interpret and make use of the monthly outlook information and to track impacts that are occurring across the Great Plains and Midwest. Our next webinar is April 21st. Again, the third Thursday of the month at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Pat Gannon from Missouri is going to be our presenter. You can access these webinars after they are recorded and at the University, or at the Midwestern Regional Climate Center and at the High Plains Regional Climate Center. And just as a courtesy, we're going to simplify the issue, we'll just deal with questions at the end again. So our agenda for today is going to be a review of some current conditions and look back at the winter in February. We'll look at some of our local impacts across the region, ag, horticulture, fire, and water. And then we'll look at the outlooks, what's happening with La Nina, El Nino to La Nina, and look at our spring and summer outlooks. So kind of a review of current conditions, looking back at what February was like across the country. Really warm conditions, all except for the southeast, warmer than average throughout all of our region, ranging from, and this is based on 122 years of data, from about the 25th warmest, say in Indiana, to the 5th warmest or 2nd warmest as you get up into Montana for the month of February. From a precipitation standpoint, a bit more of a mixed bag, wetter to the east, the far eastern part of the region, drier than average from Illinois down to Kansas and around to Montana, and middle of the road up in the north central part of the state, or north central part of the country, from a precipitation distribution standpoint. The dry conditions across from Kansas over to Illinois were a bit of a change from what we saw earlier in the winter, where we had much wetter than average conditions. And some of the dryness is starting to show up. We'll talk about that as we go along here. If we extend this back a little bit and compare the last precipitation, or for the last 90 days for temperature and precipitation, this would go back through the winter overall. The rankings on the upper left-hand side is temperature. Again, this time it's 121 years of data, and where we rank all the states in our region hit basically the top 10, except for Colorado, which had some locations in western Colorado that were a bit colder. According to Nolan Duskin, their state climatologist, the western part of their state had more stations down in valleys where they had some snow-covered valleys and had some colder than average temperatures down there. But most everywhere else, at least top 10, if not top 5 warmest winters on record. The precipitation side, you can see very clearly Iowa, their wettest winter on record. If you remember back some of the conditions we had with very wet conditions early on, other top 10 wettest years, and a little bit drier as we went further west. Wyoming actually on the dry side, 39th driest overall, and we're going to see that as we go along here. Another odd thing about the winter looking back, if we separated the temperature rankings into high temperatures and low temperatures, you would see throughout much of the area that the high temperatures were warmer than average, but not as extreme on the scale as if we ranked out the low temperatures. For most of the winter, the low temperature average was near record or very top 5 warmest. Part of the reason contributing that was due to possibly some cloudiness. This was data from the Sioux Falls National Weather Service office, and this is data for, and this is sky cover in Sioux Falls and Sioux City, Iowa. Particularly right here, you can notice the percentage of days that were cloudy on the left-hand side. This is over the last 5 years, partly cloudy and clear. And basically, the take-home message here was that for the winter, Sioux Falls had less than 15% actually clear days. And if you look over on the cloudy days, about 40% of the days were cloudy. And when you have cloudy conditions any time of year, those modify your temperature distribution in that you don't get as warm during the daytime because you have less sunlight, but those clouds also keep you warmer at nighttime. So clouds may have played a role in our overall temperature situation this winter. Looking at the most recent 30 and 90-day precipitation, 30-day in the upper left-hand side, 90-day in the lower right-hand side, slightly shifted from where we were looking at the whole month period. Again, in the lower right-hand side, see the percent of normal, so greens into purples are wetter than average. Over in the eastern part of the Midwest, 150 plus % of average. Drier areas into North Dakota, parts of Kansas, and those parts of Montana and Wyoming. But if you look at the last 30 days, you see a much drier than average pattern over the last 30 days. So some of this has actually been beneficial to some of those wetter areas that were wet early and have dried out now, that are making things better from an ag perspective, while you see some wetter areas overall in the far eastern part of the basin. The kind of driving point here is to look at what is happening in the way of soil moisture. That adds to how people can get out and do early field work. Are they going to be able to plant on time, delayed in planting? And this also contributes to what we see in the way of runoff. So this is a product, also a NOAA product, showing soil moisture, and this is a combination of several models and comparing them to average. So if their areas are white, they are close to average for this time of year. These are in millimeters, so you divide by 25 to get inches. So the areas that are darker in blue are 1 to 2 to 4 to 6 inches above average. And on the opposite side of the scale, you get 1 to 2 to 4 inches below average soil moisture. So a couple things to point out here. You can see very clearly the area just outside of our region down the south that has been very wet because of heavy rainfalls recently. Also areas from the upper peninsula of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa showing up as wetter than average. You see between these two in Illinois and showing up as that much wetter than average. Jim Angel from Illinois did point out that that's probably because an average at this time of year is fairly wet soil. So that you are close to average does not mean you're not wet. It just means you're closer to average. So we have fairly wet conditions in the middle part of the Corn Belt, a little drier in the east over into the Ohio area, and also some drying areas up in Minnesota and North Dakota and parts of South Dakota, also down into Nebraska and Kansas. Also pockets further out. You're going to see this on the U.S. Drought Monitor here as we go along. That's our first question that comes around to the ag side, is will this be wet enough to delay planting? And that will remain to be seen based on how much additional precipitation we get. These recent warm temperatures and drier conditions are helping to dry things out. we actually do have some early ag activity that we'll talk about here in just a second. Reflecting those dry conditions, going back to last fall, the U.S. Drought Monitor just released this morning. You see throughout most of the Midwest and Plains, we have white areas indicating no conditions at all related to anything to do with drought. You see in Colorado some D0 areas, and also from North Dakota, South Dakota, out into Montana and Wyoming, some large areas of D0. Again, this is not considered specifically drought. There shouldn't be a related impact to it, but indicating dry conditions where there could be an impact showing up soon. And then we have parts of eastern North Dakota, parts of Wyoming, Montana, and parts of western Montana that do have some D1 moderate drought, and a few small pockets of D2, what we call severe drought, where we have some more intense dry conditions. These areas did increase somewhat because of ongoing dryness this week, and will have to be monitored as we go along here for potential changes further as we go along. Just to point out, again, outside of our area, getting into Nevada and California, still ongoing severe drought situations. There has been some improvement because of El Nino-related precipitation this year, but not sufficient to do widespread improvements in those areas. Okay, that's kind of a review of where we are with conditions. Let's look at some of the impact issues gathered from some of our colleagues across the region, and let's point out a few things and a kind of a potpourri of just different things. I didn't show a map on this. Very warm early March. Overall, ranking in top 10, a lot of different places, really has woken people up to potential early season issues. From our friends in Wyoming, Justin Durner and Tony Bergantino, Cheyenne Weather Service was reporting in February they had 20 days of 40-mile-per-hour or more winds, which tied for the most in February. I believe their peak was 68 miles per hour in that area. The Mississippi River and Great Lakes are open for shipping and much earlier than average. Very little ice left over, so they're up and moving. Also a report about much reduced road winter maintenance in the Illinois area because of the lack of severity in the winter. Some other impacts on the ag side. Well, getting reports of early green up all the way from Kansas into the Dakotas and Montana and Wyoming. Grasses are starting to green. Winter wheat is starting to green up. Winter wheat has actually made it to a point of near jointing in southern Kansas. That can be a problem this early because we're still a ways away from our potential last spring freeze. We'll talk about that here in just a second. There does sound like a decent amount of field work going on, early season tillage, nitrogen application, a number of things getting ready for actual planting. Soils have dried out in areas that were able to do that. That has been more in the Plains area, Iowa into Illinois. I don't believe there's as much of that going on because soil conditions are a little bit too wet in that place, in those areas. Also, several reports of small grains, spring wheat, barley, oats, and mostly the Plain states being planted. We're still a bit early for any corn or soybeans or anything like that. From an environmental standpoint, we've seen many reports of early dormancy break on flowers and trees. The image I showed from the University of Nebraska showing early dormancy break of trees there, lots of flowers. This is, again, a potential concern. I'll show you something here from Missouri in just a second. Early bird migration, birds working their way northward. There was I had a reporter questioning a pheasant habitat going on because of the early warmth and what that could mean. Reports from Minnesota and the Dakotas on early ice out in lakes and ponds, and also frost out of the ground, which is kind of a mixed situation going on right now. This is a plot from the National Weather Service showing places where the frost depth, the red areas, there is no frost depth to speak of. Green areas indicate frost depth at an 8 to 20 inch. Yellows are 2 to 4 inches. So it's kind of a mixed bag on where you are. Also even into South Dakota, getting some reports that there's still a little bit of frost depth based on what kind of surface you are under. But if the frost has not gone out, it will be heading out here relatively soon as we get back to warmer conditions in the next couple of weeks. Not going to go into detail here, but Pat Gannon from Missouri did list a number of reports from central to southern Missouri, where a large number of horticultural plants were breaking dormancy earlier and leaving them in a potential situation where if we were to get a freeze, and we're still a ways away from even the early last freeze dates, that there could be a problem. They can handle some close to freezing events. You can see the potential bud kill at these different levels, and we won't go into these, but if you want to review these later. I have learned that certain trees, such as apple orchards, after apples do bloom, they don't mind a little bit of additional freeze, or they don't mind a minor freeze event, because that kills off some of the blooms and reduces them having to do some of the bloom reduction themselves. Here are just to give you some comparison on where we are right now. We're in the middle of March. This is the median date, or the middle value of the last 32 freeze events based on 81 to 2010 average. So you can see that even down in these southern areas where we've had this break, we're looking at probably in the April 1 to 10, first part of April is the median date. So we're still in a potential freeze area. Obviously, as you go further north, we're well into May before the median last freeze date. Conditions have not, we've not had enough things moving along up in the northern areas to be much of a problem yet. Probably more of a problem on the horticultural areas further south and some of the winter wheat in the Kansas area. There is going to be some colder air moving through the region associated with this cold front right now. It doesn't look like it's going to be too seriously cold, but it's something people should be monitoring as we go along here. Just for a quick check on soil temperatures, we noted frost depth already. 4-inch soil temperatures, southern parts of the region, we're well into the 50s, some parts of South Dakota even touching 50 degrees already, up in the 30s, up into North Dakota and parts of Wyoming. As we look over in eastern states, mostly above freezing. The green areas are in that 50 degree range, up into up into Michigan, mostly 40s. So the overall warm winter has allowed soil temperatures to warm up relatively quickly. Another place you can find out some of that information, especially if you're dealing with corn planting, is a tool as part of a regional project that is approaching its end, called Useful to Usable. And the website is agclimate4u.org. What this tool does is it allows you as corn producers to be able to select their location, select their planting date, their corn maturity date, and it allows them to track degree days throughout the season. It also allows them to make some decisions if they have a replant situation because of freeze or rain out or hail or something like that. But one of the things that this tool also does is it gives you the spring and fall freeze dates for your area over the last 30 years and a distribution. The map that I showed across the whole region is very useful to give you a broad perspective, but to look at an individual location and get a distribution of the freeze dates for your area, you can often find those via your state climatologist or this tool from at this website from Useful to Usable project, agclimate4u.org, and look for corn growing degree day tool. On the decision dashboard, and give you some idea of freeze dates in your area, and also you can track growing degree days throughout the year. Another impact on the fire side, we expect some fires at this time of year because of some dry conditions, and we have grasses that have not greened up yet. That combination always leads to some spring fire condition. The plot on the left shows the large fire incidents from the USDA Forest Service, a few down in the far southern parts of our region, and then one up in Montana currently. This is as of several days ago now. But there have been, so not too many big events, but lots of smaller events that have been able to be knocked down. There have been some burn bans. I've heard temporary burn bans in South Dakota and some in North Dakota. But again, this is not uncommon this time of year due to lack of green up. As temperatures warm quickly, and we also tend to have low relative humidities because there's not much growing at this time of year, transpiring moisture, and combination with winds, those add up to prime fire conditions pretty quickly. From the Missouri River system and other river systems, just kind of a touch on where we are right now. This is the 7-day average stream flow. The scale is across the bottom. Anything that's in green is near the middle of the distribution. Areas in blue are wetter, and then areas that are tan to brown are in drier. So middle part of our region, mostly middle of the road distribution for this time of year. Some wetter areas from Ohio down to the southern Mississippi, or the southern Mississippi Basin area where we've been very wet. Some dry areas in Kansas and Nebraska partially, and also some dry areas up in Wyoming and Montana, and then wetter around the Black Hills and Minnesota. From a Missouri River standpoint, looking at where we are with stream flows and snow content, snow water content into the Missouri River, this is for the upper Missouri above Fort Peck and Fort Peck to Garrison. The red line is the 30-year average, the 30-year average accumulation. The blue shaded area is where we are this year. So above Fort Peck, we're running about 92% of average, a little bit below average. But the area that enters between Fort Peck and Garrison, mainly the Yellowstone River, comes out of part of Montana and northern Wyoming. Much less snowpack in that area. They are running in the 74% of average area. Still a bit of time to pick up some accumulation. But something else we have also seen, and the Army Corps was reporting, was getting an additional early runoff because of the warmer conditions has actually started melting off the lower elevation snowpack already. So they're expected this early season to continue and then to fall off relatively quickly as that snow melt has occurred. One other contrast is in the Platte Basin. The same plots here for the North Platte and South Platte they've dropped off a little bit behind, or we're running close to average compared to what was happening in the Missouri. They've fallen off over the last few weeks also. From a flood risk standpoint, this is from the Missouri River Basin River Forecast Center and NOAA. This was just released today, indicating areas where they're expecting minor flooding in the tan and moderate flooding in the orange. So most of our region where they expect minor flooding to occur is basically Wisconsin to part of the Platte River in Nebraska on over to Indiana. Some moderate flooding is possible from southeastern Iowa down into Missouri and along the Mississippi River. Note that a large part of this minor flooding area, that is expected every year, so it would be close to average. In some places, we still do have a little bit below average chances for flooding in the minor flooding area. Some of the moderate flooding area, that is also expected because of some of the wet regions in Missouri, and because of spring convective systems that do occur can cause minor flooding even without background wet conditions. So let's step ahead and look at the outlooks. We'll look at where we are with El Nino, 7-day, and look out to where we are all the way into summer. We'll do a bit more of a look ahead into summer here because of the beginning of our growing season. First off with El Nino, where are we with El Nino? Upper left-hand side is sea surface temperatures compared to average in a loop that goes from December until early March. And that area in the Central Pacific, the warmer than average sea surface temperatures, is dissipating. Still fairly strong comparatively, but is dissipating as we go along. And the lower right-hand side, this is a profile as we look at depth. See where the sea surface temperatures are much warmer than average, but are becoming much shallower compared to where they were before. And you see more of the cold water that's colder than average water that's starting to develop, which is indicative of the El Nino weakening and starting to head towards La Nina conditions. But we still are a relatively strong El Nino overall. We are definitely seeing weakening, and this does rank as one of the top 3 events in the last 65 years overall. When do we get out of that get through that transition from El Nino into neutral or La Nina conditions? This is a plot from the International Research Institute at Columbia University in a partner with NOAA. These are 3-month periods from February, March, April. Here's June, July, August, all the way to October, November, December. And the bars on each one give the probability of being in El Nino, which is in red, neutral, which is in green, between El Nino and La Nina, and then La Nina in blue, which is the opposite phase of El Nino. And can pretty clearly show what is expected to happen. As we go through the spring, the probability of El Nino begins to weaken. Here we are in April, May, June. That 3-month period, we still have about a 75% chance of being in El Nino. As we get into the summer months, you see the green bar is the highest, around a 50% or just below probability of being in neutral conditions between El Nino and La Nina. We have to go through that transition phase. And then the probability of La Nina becomes stronger as we get into the fall. Possibly late summer, but more likely to get into the fall and next winter. We'll watch that transition. This transition is being watched very closely in the ag community, looking at what that might mean for the summer growing season. There's been a lot of speculation about that. But as it stands right now, it looks like we'll likely be in neutral conditions through the winter, or neutral conditions through the summer, with a higher probability of transitioning into the fall and winter. So let's look at some of the outlook maps here. This is a plot of the next 7-day precipitation. This is model-based on what is projected to happen. This is total precipitation. You can see some areas of up to an 0.8 of an inch projected with the current system going on right now, and potential for another system coming in next week, bringing a bit more of precipitation to the area. For those people who live in the northern plains, we expect to have 1 or 2 larger snowfall events in the late winter, early spring. That's just projected. That's part of climatology, and oftentimes it is expected by ranchers like to have it because that tends to produce some runoff that they collect in ponds and dugouts, and also adds moisture to rangeland areas. The downside of it is they're tending to go through calving this time of year, and you can't get sort of a livestock loss. So there's some good and bad associated with it. That's why we're trying to watch and give them projected heads up to try to minimize if one does happen, that we minimize the loss of livestock in it. Jumping ahead to the 8 to 14-day outlook, getting us to the end of the month. Our current cold stretch is going to go away, and we'll likely get into warmer than average conditions over much of the region, except for far western Wyoming, Montana, and parts of the Great Lakes, which are more likely to be near normal conditions towards the end of the month. Much of the rest of the area has an increased chance of being above average for temperature. Most of the region, if not all of it, except for maybe Kansas, has above average chances for precipitation. The precipitation pattern looks like it will start getting a bit more active as we get along to the end of the month. The 30-day outlook for April, temperature on the left-hand side, precipitation on the right-hand side. More so, warmer is more likely part of it, with EC equal chances for temperature below or above average throughout most of the region. We have a bit of Madden-Julian oscillation activity that's driving part of this, along with El Nino. We won't talk about the MJO too much. Maybe another opportunity we'll talk about that. From a precipitation standpoint, the more active pattern through the month is projected to be further south. That is still a bit El Nino looking-ish, with drier over the Great Lakes. That is more indicative of an expected pattern that you see during El Nino conditions. We take the 30-day outlook, April to June. We have a consistent pattern here, what we've seen from the last months, with warmer than average conditions. And I apologize, I failed to update this one. This is the last month. The 30-day outlook for April through June does look somewhat similar, but there were some slight modifications to this. When we get to the slide set, I'll make sure this is updated. And then jumping ahead through the June through August time period, temperature on the left-hand side, precipitation on the right-hand side. Computer models and some other indicators are holding on to this idea of warmer than average conditions throughout the whole country as we go into the summertime. In odd contrast, well, not an odd contrast, but as we get out of El Nino, our ability to project much in the way of precipitation, especially in the convective season, becomes much less. So the whole area is considered EC equal chances. There have been several iterations looking at the computer models, and right now there just are not strong indications about what's going to happen in the way of precipitation. There will probably be some drier areas throughout the Corn Belt somewhere, but it's really hard to pin down how those are right now. We don't see any indications of widespread dry conditions. The interesting fact about the temperature-wise, and something we do need to be aware of, is that with this idea of warmer than average conditions possible throughout the region, this would induce some impacts in and of itself, because the central and southern part of the Corn Belt, especially in the middle of the season, their temperatures are near the stress point for corn already. Above average temperatures would introduce some additional stress. It could be mitigated some if you had enough moisture. If you're a little bit dry, it can be somewhat worse. So just by the fact of having warmer than average conditions more likely, we would expect to see a little bit more stress on crops this year. Northern areas, the warmer than average temperatures, as long as you have some moisture with them, this tends to be more of a benefit. Helps to lengthen your growing season, helps to add a few more heat units onto especially more heat-driven crops like corn. Therefore, it would be a better season for them, again, if you have enough moisture to deal with. Up through the 30th of June, because we have no droughts, or very little drought over the area, no indications, and there's really not indications of drought developing at this point. We do see removal potential in North Dakota, and also some removal potential in parts of Montana and Wyoming possibly, because spring is a time we tend to have a bit more precipitation compared to average, or excuse me, average precipitation is more beneficial at that point. Further up the area into Montana, the drought persists in those areas is most likely. So kind of a summary of conditions. Warmer nearly everywhere this past winter. You know, we were wet earlier and drier some late in the winter. We've seen an early onset of spring with some potential for freeze issues in those areas where we've had the dormancy break. So we're going to have to watch that very carefully. You know, memories of 2007 have been brought up from some people where we saw an early dormancy break and then saw an Easter freeze that did a lot of damage in the southeastern part of the Corn Belt area. Not projecting that again, but something we're going to watch very closely. There's been early ag activity in some places. The dry conditions have helped move that along, and we've got that potential horticulture problem. So kind of a summary on the outlooks. We are in what's called an advisory category for El Nino with the El Nino going on, but it is weakening. We're going to be transitioning out of that likely in the late spring to summer. And you know, right now the best estimates are that we get into La Nina by fall, but you know, it could possibly be next winter. We'll see when that actually occurs. Our spring is mixed. You know, likely warmer north, less so in the south. Wetter conditions are more likely across the south. Warmer conditions are more likely across the whole region during the summer, as we've talked about, with no strong indications on precipitation. So just a reminder of all of our partners here, the Regional Climate Center, State Climatologists, NOAA, National Weather Service, and our friends at NIDIS and the National Drought Mitigation Center. And these are some of our partners across the region. And thanks for being here. We will now open it up for questions and discussion.
Hey, Dennis, while we're waiting for, hi, this is Doug. While we're waiting for those questions, why don't you, since you have control of the computer, why don't you pull up the latest CPC April, May, and June maps, since we didn't put those in there, okay?
I will do that right now. Okay.
And Jim, are you able to see what questions are being asked, or people can you can either do it that way, type them in, or you can simply unmute yourselves, I guess. I'm not sure how that's done.
Yeah, if they want to ask the question themselves, just do a *6 to unmute yourself and then ask the question, or you may type it in like Doug suggested there, and I can unmute you if you use the audio pin, or I could read it for Dennis or Doug. Nothing's come in to the written questions as of yet, though.
Okay. Here's where we are looking at the 90-day temperature outlook. Again, mostly warm across most of the northern parts of the region. EC equal chances across southern parts of the region. And the 3-month temperature outlook or precipitation outlook looks very similar to the 30-day, with drier over the Great Lakes and wetter further to the south. Very El Nino looking like condition there. So questions? Do we have any questions?
Okay, I did get one in here from Benjamin Diamond. Ben, I've unmuted you. Do you want to go ahead and ask the question online?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Hello, this is...
Okay. Hi. So I was wondering if there were any spring planting concerns with soil moisture being the soil being too wet?
We've been having discussions about that over parts of the area I showed is on the soil moisture from Iowa to Illinois to Missouri and potentially up to Wisconsin. Certainly with the wetness early on in the winter, for those of you who don't know much about soils, soils that get wet, especially deep in the profile during the fall and winter, it's very difficult to dry those out because the main way of drying those out is by having something growing in them and extracting the moisture, and we don't get anything growing. The surfaces can dry out. Right now, I'd say there's not huge concerns. The recent dryness has helped them out, but if we were to get a bit more active or another couple big events, we could see some slowdown in those areas.
Okay.
And we are, I guess, from a dryness standpoint, there are pockets of, either, I think in parts of Nebraska, and certainly I've seen some comments in North Dakota that the soils are a little dry and they're starting to be a little concerned. They're not major, major problems yet, but those early stages of people taking note of dry conditions in those areas.
Okay, we do have another question from Mark Norton. And Mark, you're unmuted, so you can go ahead if you'd like.
What would a La Nina mean for precipitation and temps this fall?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
If it does switch to La Nina this fall, what would that mean for precipitation and temperatures?
For the fall. Right now,
are you interested in a certain area or just broadly across the north central part of the U.S.?
Broadly.
There are not as strong an indications for what happens from a fall standpoint across the region. I am pulling up a quick look here at what happens in the fall from a temperature standpoint. The warmer than average temperatures are still expected from the Climate Prediction Center into the fall, which generally is not a bad thing for most of the harvest area. And we're talking about pretty much the whole region in that area. From a precipitation standpoint, there are really no strong indications precipitation-wise as we get into the fall. Maybe a little dryness in the far southern part of the region, and maybe a little bit of wet as you get up into the far reaches of Montana, but the main part of our area, Corn Belt and Plains, no strong indications on precipitation.
Okay, at this time I do not have any other questions, so if anybody has a question, you can type it in if you'd like.
Doug, if you have anything else, or Jim, if you want to chime in with any additional comments if you made it on.
No, thank you very much, Dennis. That was great. Appreciate it.
Yeah, this is Jim Angel. I don't have anything to add either at this point. I think we got it pretty well covered.
Jim, what's per Ben's comment, what are things sitting like and people reacting like over in the Illinois area?
So if we look at just Illinois, that's where I'm on the ground. The soil moisture around the state is still pretty high. We've managed to get rid of some of the water from the big rains back in December, and I know that in areas that are pretty aggressively tiled, they've been able to remove a lot of that water pretty well. But it's still a little on the wet side. We've had a couple of rains just in the last couple of days that have kind of cause water to start standing in fields again. But on the upside is that, usually if you get a week of warm, dry weather, and especially in April, you can dry out the soils pretty quickly enough that you can do field work. And once it gets going, they can cover a lot of ground pretty quickly. So at this point, I don't have any real concerns about planting delays. And just as long as things remain as they are, where we have these long stretches between main events, I think we'll be okay.
And Jim's right. It is remarkable how quickly condition. We're not to the main corn planting time yet. We've still got a few weeks to go before that. But when there are windows, it is amazing how quickly corn planting can occur. Back in 2012, it was pretty dry, but there was a 1 week period where half the corn went in a 1 week period. It is truly amazing with the large equipment they have now that when fields are ready to go, they can move quite quickly on.
Okay, Benjamin had another question. Ben, you want to go ahead and answer or ask that question?
Sure. Could you elaborate more on the crops that were at risk of drought damage during June through August when you were showing the forecast?
Well, you would be more in a situation with corn and soybeans being the most potential for drought damage. Especially if we were to turn dry later in the season, it would be more damage to soybeans because most producers know that the peak time for corn is that tasseling period, which most places in the region occurs sometime during the month of July. And if you introduce stress, high temperatures, or reduced amount of available moisture during that tasseling time, that is a peak time for yield loss. You can cause more later, but that's the biggest time for potential yield loss. Soybeans, you shift that time into August. That if you introduce stress to them during the month of August, you'll reduce yield. There's not quite the same critical peak time where you can do damage, but if you have an extended period of dryness or heat during the month of August, yield on soybeans. So right now we're going to have to take a watch and see approach to what the potential is for damage on those.
Okay.
And Dennis, in terms of analogous years, I believe, I'm trying not to quote you, but 2013 was one of those years where it started off relatively wet and dried out and got hot.
Jim, can you help me out on these? I'm trying to remember. I mean, the 83 was a big one where there was a lot of yield loss. It was a transition year from El Nino to La Nina where it was very wet early and dried out later. I'm not projecting another one of those events yet. I'm coming up with a blank on any more recent ones than that.
Yeah, I think 2013 was one where we did that transition from early wetness to dryness later on. The other part of the equation, though, is the temperature. Last two summers have been exceptionally mild temperature-wise, and that saved us a lot of heartache on some of the dry weather we did have.
Okay, guys, I do not have any other questions. Oh, I take that back. One more from Ben. Go ahead, Ben. All right, try it again, Ben.
The 2007 dormancy. For the 2007 dormancy freeze, could you elaborate on that and how we compare to 2007?
Actually, Jim, you were a little bit closer to that. Do you want to fill in any there?
Yeah, so in 2007 we had an extraordinarily warm March, and I think especially in the southern part of the Corn Belt. I know in Illinois we were 14 degrees above average for the month, and we had many days in the upper 70s and even up into the 80-degree range. So we were probably, in many respects, 1 to 2 months ahead of schedule on how things had emerged. And then we got a cold spell in around Easter in April of that year with some pretty cold temperatures. There was a cold air, a kind of classic cold air outbreak, a strong cold front pushed through, so we had cold temperatures down into the low 20s moving across Illinois. So, it's one of these things that are traditional means of protecting against frost in the orchards and places like that just wouldn't work. It was pretty much a hopeless situation. So there was a tremendous amount of damage in the orchards, and also alfalfa got hit pretty hard, as did winter wheat.
And it was more of a problem in the eastern and southern part of our region because conditions further north and further west, things had not progressed far enough to where there was widespread damage. So it was more damage down in that area. I think the total loss was noted about $4 billion because of the damage, mostly horticultural, though some agricultural.
And although in 2012 we had even warmer temperatures, a large part of the area never did get below freezing. However, those areas in 2012 beyond March that did get below freezing had substantial damage, especially to Michigan cherry crops and such. So something like 90% of the crop was lost.
And that's
right.
That's something that, from a climate perspective, is something we can tell people about some advanced level of risk, just because this is so early for this occurring.
Okay, don't see anything else coming in at this time, guys.
Okay, thank you, Doug and Jim, for chiming in. Thank you for the questions and for attending. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Please join us next month with Pat Gannon.